6 weeks before my art show, I personally handed the invitations to my daughter-in-law. She smiled and said, "Don't worry, Dad. We'll all be there." But on opening day, as I stood alone beside the piece engraved with my wife's and son's names, my phone rang. My son said, "It's just a little art show. It's not that important. I already have a trip planned with my in-laws." I was devastated, but I quietly made a decision that would soon leave them both drowning in regret. Before we begin, thank you for being here. It genuinely warms my heart. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Drop your city, your state, your country. I love knowing who's in this community with me. A quick note. This story contains fictional elements woven in for storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to names or places is coincidental, but the lesson it carries is absolutely worth your time. I poured 2 cups of coffee this morning. I do it every single day, and every single day I stand at the kitchen counter staring at that second cup, like it's going to explain itself to me. 4 years. You'd think the habit would have broken by now. You'd think my hands would have learned. But muscle memory is a stubborn thing, and Eleanor always took her coffee with 2 sugars and a splash of cream, so that's exactly how I made it. 2 sugars, a splash of cream, and I set it across from mine at the small kitchen table like she was about to walk in from the bedroom and ask me what I was staring at. The apartment was quiet, the way only early mornings can be quiet, in a place that used to hold more people than it does now. I'm Raymond Kowalski, Ray Mosley. 68 years old, retired machinist widower going on 4 years this October. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a building called Sycamore Court, which has no sycamore trees anywhere near it, a fact Eleanor would have found deeply amusing. The apartment is fine. It has good light in the mornings, and a parking spot included in the rent, and neighbors who mostly keep to themselves. It is not the house on Delwood Avenue where Eleanor and I lived for 31 years, where Daniel grew up, where we painted the kitchen yellow twice, because Eleanor changed her mind after the first coat dried, and said the color made her feel like she was living inside a lemon. Daniel was the one who suggested the apartment. "It just makes more sense, Dad," he'd said, standing in the living room of the Delwood house with his hands in his pockets, looking around at everything like he was calculating square footage. "It's a lot of upkeep for one person. What if something happens to you and nobody's there?" I told him I'd think about it. I thought about it for 3 weeks, and then I signed the listing agreement, and then I packed 31 years into a moving truck and drove away without looking in the rearview mirror because I knew if I looked, I wouldn't be able to keep driving. That was 2 years ago. The apartment is fine. I pulled the second coffee cup toward me and drank from it standing up, because what was the point of sitting across from an empty chair? Outside the kitchen window, the maple tree in the courtyard was going orange at the edges the way it always did in early October. Eleanor used to press leaves between the pages of her cookbooks. I found them for years afterward bright red and amber flattened thin, tucked between recipes she'd bookmarked and never made. I had things to do today. 6 weeks from today, on the 4th Saturday of October, the Millbrook Community Gallery was holding its annual juried art show. 12 artists, 40-some pieces. And for the first time in my 68 years on this earth, I was going to be one of those artists. I had 24 ceramic pieces sitting in my workshop, the 2nd bedroom I'd converted the week I moved in over Daniel's suggestion that it would make a nice guest room. The pieces were wrapped in cloth and arranged on the shelves I'd built along the east wall, and every morning when I opened that workshop door and turned on the light, I felt something I didn't have a name for right away when it first started happening. It took me a few months to figure out it was purpose. Not pride, not accomplishment. Just the solid, grounded feeling of a man who knows what he's supposed to be doing with his hands. I rinsed both cups in the sink, dried them, and put them away. Then I opened the workshop door and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at what 3.5 years of Tuesday and Thursday mornings had become. "Okay, Eleanor," I said out loud because I talk to her sometimes, and I've stopped being embarrassed about it. "Today I'm making the invitations." She didn't answer. She never does. But the morning light came through the east window and hit the shelves at exactly the right angle, and every piece on those shelves seemed to glow for just a second. And I thought, not for the first time, that there were worse ways for a 68-year-old man to spend his autumn. I had something I'd been building for 3.5 years, something Eleanor never got to do herself, and I wasn't entirely sure Daniel even knew about it. To understand why a retired machinist with hands more accustomed to steel and engine grease spent 3.5 years learning to center clay on a pottery wheel, you have to understand Eleanor. Eleanor Marie Kowalski, born Eleanor Marie Davison, grew up in a small town in western Pennsylvania where her father ran a hardware store and her mother taught 3rd grade, and nobody in her family had ever made anything you'd call art. She would have told you she wasn't an artistic person. She would have said it cheerfully, the way she said most things, with her chin up and her eyes bright, like she was reporting a perfectly satisfying fact about someone she knew well. But Eleanor had a weakness for beautiful things made by hand. There was a small pottery gallery 3 blocks from the dry cleaner she used on Tuesdays, a little storefront called Clay & Company, with pieces arranged in the window that caught the light in ways that made Eleanor slow down every single time she walked past. She never bought anything. She'd press her nose practically to the glass, tipping her head to look at a particular bowl or vase, and then she'd shake her head and keep walking. At one of these days, she told me once when I caught her doing it on our way to dinner, "I'm going to go in there and sign up for a class." "So go sign up," I said. She laughed and tucked her arm through mine. "When I have time, Ray." The thing about Eleanor was that she always meant to have time. It was always just around the corner, after the holidays, after Daniel's graduation, after we finished refinishing the floors, after. She was not a woman who sat still. She volunteered at the hospital gift shop on Thursdays, ran the church bake sale every November, kept a vegetable garden that produced more zucchini than 2 people could ever reasonably eat. And somewhere in all of that, the pottery class stayed exactly where it had always been, just around the corner waiting. Then her doctor found something on a scan that he didn't like the look of. And time, which Eleanor had always assumed she had plenty of, turned out to be something else entirely. 14 months. From diagnosis to the morning, I sat beside her bed and held her hand and watched her breathing change. The night before, she slipped away for good. The last night, she was truly with me, truly herself. She squeezed my hand so hard it surprised me. Her eyes were clear, and she looked at me the way she'd looked at me since we were 24 years old, and figuring out how to be adults together, like I was both the most familiar and most remarkable thing she'd ever seen. "Ray," she said, and her voice was thin but steady. "I never made anything with my hands." Her eyes filled up and spilled over twin tracks running toward her ears. "I always meant to." My throat locked up so completely that I couldn't have pushed a single word through it if my life had depended on it. I pressed her hand to my cheek and held it there. And 3 months after we buried her, I walked into Clay & Company on a Tuesday morning and told the young woman behind the counter that I wanted to sign up for the beginner's wheel-throwing class. She asked if I had any experience. I told her no. She handed me a registration form and a smile and told me the class met on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 9. My hands shook through the entire first session. The clay collapsed twice. The instructor, a patient woman named Deborah, who had clearly seen worse than a grieving 65-year-old machinist, set it back up each time without a word of frustration, just steady hands guiding mine back to center. "Feel that," she said. "Right there, that's where it wants to be." I felt it. and something cracked open in my chest that had been sealed shut for 3 months. I kept going back, every Tuesday and Thursday for 3.5 years. I filled the second bedroom with shelves. I ruined more pieces than I kept. I learned the difference between earthenware and stoneware, between a bisque fire and a glaze fire, between making something functional and making something true. Somewhere in the middle of all of it, Eleanor's friend Margaret Ellison called to check on me. Margaret had been Eleanor's closest friend since their children were in elementary school together, and she called every few weeks whether I wanted her to or not, which was, I came to understand, exactly what I needed. "Eleanor told me you started pottery classes," Margaret said. I was surprised. "She knew. She's the one who told you to sign up, Ray." Margaret's voice was warm and a little exasperated the way it got when she thought I was being slow. "You just didn't know it yet." I kept going back, and somewhere along the way I stopped making things for practice. I started making them for her. Daniel was not always this way. That is the hardest thing to say out loud, because it means something was lost, and lost things hurt more than things you never had to begin with. When Daniel was 9 years old, he used to follow me into the garage on Saturday mornings and hand me tools before I asked for them. He'd learned the names of everything: socket wrench, torque, wrench, needle, nose, pliers, and he'd stand beside me with his arms crossed over his chest, watching my hands with the focused expression of a boy who believed his father knew exactly what he was doing. I didn't always, but I never told him that. A 9-year-old boy who believes in you is a gift you don't argue with. He grew into a decent man, quiet like his mother said I used to be before the years settled me into something louder. He worked in supply chain management for a logistics company downtown, wore the same 3 pairs of shoes in rotation called Eleanor every Sunday without being reminded. When Eleanor got sick, he drove 3 hours from Columbus every other weekend and sat with her while I handled whatever needed handling: prescriptions, insurance calls, the endless paperwork that illness generates, like it's trying to drown you in bureaucracy while you're already underwater. The night Eleanor passed, Daniel cried in a way I had never seen him cry. Not the polished, contained grief of a grown man in public, but deep, gasping, chest-heaving sobs that shook his whole body, the kind of crying that strips a person down to something raw and unguarded. I held on to him in the hospital hallway and felt his grief and my own tangled up together until I couldn't tell which was which. For 3 months after the funeral, he called me every single evening. 7:30, regular as the news. He'd ask what I had for dinner, what I was watching, whether I'd gotten out of the house that day. Small questions. The kind that mean, I see you, I know you're still there, I'm still here too. Then Sarah Mercer walked into his life, and everything changed so gradually that I didn't notice it happening until it had already happened. I want to be fair about Sarah. In the beginning, I genuinely liked her. She was sharp and well-organized and laughed easily, which are qualities I admire in a person. She called me Dad within the first 2 months of dating Daniel, which surprised me but didn't bother me. It felt warm, like she was choosing us rather than tolerating us. When she and Daniel came for Sunday dinners, she helped clear the table without being asked. She sat across from me and asked about my work, about the neighborhood, about how Eleanor and I had met, and she listened with both eyes on me like she was actually storing the answers somewhere useful. She's good for him, Eleanor had said near the end when Daniel brought Sarah to visit for the last time. Eleanor was tired that day, but her eyes had tracked Sarah around the room with the careful attention she gave to things she was forming opinions about. She's organized. Daniel needs organized. I thought about those words a lot in the months after. The calls shifted first. 7:30 became 8, then 8 became whenever, then whenever became a few times a week. Then a few times a week became Sunday afternoons, short ones, with Sarah's voice sometimes audible in the background, asking Daniel something. I told myself this was normal. Newlyweds find their footing. A man builds a life with his wife, and that life requires attention. Then the Sunday dinners stopped, not all at once. They tapered once a month, then every 6 weeks, then holidays and birthdays only. I told myself this was also normal. I had friends whose children lived in different states entirely, whose grandchildren were practically strangers. At least Daniel was 3 hours away, not 3,000. But the thing that stayed with me, the thing that I turned over in my mind during those Tuesday and Thursday mornings in the workshop, was a visit Daniel made alone about 8 months after the wedding. He showed up on a Saturday unannounced, said he was passing through on his way back from a work thing. He walked through the apartment, asked how I was stood in the doorway of the workshop with his hands in his pockets, and looked at the shelves. "Dad," he said, and his voice had something careful in it, something measured. "This is a lot of stuff." 22 pieces, I said. "Working on 23. He looked at the shelves for another moment, then looked at me. "Sarah thinks," he started, then stopped, took a different approach. "Have you thought about what you're going to do with all of it?" "I'm going to show it," I said. "There's a gallery in town that does a juried show every October." Something moved across Daniel's face, not dismissal exactly, more like an adjustment, the way a person adjusts their expression when they're deciding how to respond to news they weren't expecting. "That's great, Dad," he said. "That's really great." He left an hour later. He hugged me at the door, and I held on a beat longer than I usually would. And he let me, which told me he felt something too. Some awareness that the distance between us was wider than the 3 hours of highway connecting our zip codes. I stood in the doorway after his taillights disappeared around the corner, and I thought about what Eleanor had said. She's good for him. She's organized. Daniel needs organized. I thought about the 9-year-old boy who knew the name of every tool in my garage. And then I went back into the workshop and started on piece 23. Something was coming. I couldn't have told you what. But I could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive, that shift in the air, that particular stillness that tells you the sky is deciding something. It started with the house. In my experience, things like this almost always start with something that sounds reasonable. Something practical and logical and hard to argue with, presented in a tone of voice that suggests the other person would have to be unreasonable to object. Sarah was the one who brought it up a Sunday afternoon, about 6 months after she and Daniel got married, while the three of us were sitting on the small back patio of my apartment, with the remains of a takeout lunch between us. She'd been quiet most of the meal, the kind of quiet that I'd learned meant she was working up to something. "Dad," she said, setting down her iced tea with the decisive click of someone who has decided to begin. "Can I say something that I hope you'll take in the spirit it's meant?" "Go ahead," I said. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, and looked at me with eyes full of what appeared to be genuine concern. "We worry about you here alone. Daniel and I both do. This apartment is fine, but it's not," she chose her next word with visible care, "permanent. It was supposed to be a transitional thing right after the Delwood house." "It suits me well enough," I said. "I know it does, and that's wonderful." She nodded like she was agreeing with me before redirecting me. "But Dad, you're 66. What happens in 10 years? What happens if something goes wrong and you need help and there's nobody there?" Daniel was watching his plate. He reached over and covered my hand with his. "We just want to make sure you're taking care of Dad. That's all." I looked at my son's hand on mine. The same hand I'd steadied on a bicycle seat 30 years ago. The same hand I'd held in a hospital hallway while he sobbed for his mother. My chest ached with a tenderness I hadn't expected. "What are you suggesting?" I asked. What they suggested, it turned out, was a monthly financial arrangement. A transfer direct from my account to theirs, just to keep us connected. Sarah said, "Just so you feel like there's a net under you." The framing was gentle and warm, and the amount was modest enough to seem like support rather than dependency. I agreed. I told myself it was practical. I told myself Eleanor would have appreciated that Daniel was staying involved. I wrote the first check that evening and felt in a way I chose not to examine too closely that I was purchasing something, though I couldn't have said exactly what. 2 months later, the visits picked up. Daniel came more frequently, sometimes with Sarah, sometimes alone, and I was glad for it. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table. It felt for a while like the 7:30 phone calls had come back in a different form, but I began to notice gradually the way you notice a draft in a room before you locate the window, that the visits had a rhythm to them. They tended to arrive when something needed doing, a form to sign, a document to review, a question about my will, about my insurance, about whether I had a healthcare proxy in place. Practical things, necessary things, things I was grateful I told myself to have help navigating. Then one afternoon, about 14 months after the arrangement began, Sarah stopped in the doorway of the workshop. Daniel was in the kitchen on a call. She stood there looking at the shelves, 24 pieces now, all of them, the full collection, with her head tilted and her arms crossed. "You know what would be great in here," she said, turning to me with a bright, considering smile. "A proper guest room. Daniel and I could stay over sometimes. Really make a weekend of it." My jaw tightened before I'd decided it was going to. "I use this room," I said. "I know you do." She held up both hands, laughing lightly. "I'm just thinking out loud. All this stuff, it's beautiful, Dad, really. I just wonder if it's healthy spending so much time in here alone." Daniel appeared in the doorway behind her. "What did I miss?" "Nothing," Sarah said pleasantly, already moving back toward the kitchen. "Just admiring Dad's work." That evening after they left, I stood in the workshop for a long time. I looked at the 24 pieces on their shelves. I looked at the wheel in the corner, the tools hung in their proper places, the small framed photograph of Eleanor I'd put up beside the window the first week I moved in. I did not list the workshop as a guest room. That was the one thing Sarah Mercer would not get from me, no matter how reasonably she asked for it. A man is allowed to keep one room. I had already given up enough. The last piece was finished on a Tuesday night at 11:17, according to the clock above the workshop door. I know the exact time because I looked up at it the moment I set the bowl down on the drying shelf and took my hands away, and something in my chest shifted, not dramatically. Not the way it does in movies, just a quiet internal click, like a lock finding its position. 24 pieces. 3.5 years. Done. I stood back and looked at the shelves the way you look at something you've been too close to for too long, trying to see it fresh, the way a stranger would see it walking in for the first time. There were bowls in 3 sizes, 2 tall vases with flared lips, a set of mugs I'd thrown on the same afternoon, because Deborah had dared me to make 6 matching ones, and I'd managed 5 that were close enough to call a set. There were plates with textured rims, a wide, shallow dish glazed in the particular burnt orange color Eleanor had called her favorite, and there on the center shelf at eye level, the piece I'd saved for last, a bowl, wider than it was, tall, the walls sloping outward from the base in a slow curve I'd had to throw 4 times before I got it right. The glaze was a deep, uneven blue, the color the sky turns in the minutes just before full dark when you're not sure if you're still in day or already in night. On the interior base pressed carefully into the clay before the first firing 2 names. Eleanor. Daniel. I had made it for my son. I had intended when the show was over to place it in his hands and tell him what it meant. That felt like the right order of things: earn it first, then give it. I called Margaret the next morning. She picked up on the second ring the way she always did, as though she'd been expecting the call and simply waiting for me to get around to making it. "Ray," she said warmly. "How are you?" "I finished the last piece last night," I said. There was a pause, and then Margaret made a sound that was half laugh, half something more complicated. "Oh, Ray." Her voice caught slightly on my name. "Eleanor would be absolutely beside herself right now. You know that, don't you?" My throat tightened the way it still did sometimes when someone said her name like that, like she was still nearby, just in another room. "I'm putting together the show submission this week," I said when I trusted my voice again. "The juried exhibition at Millbrook Gallery, 4th Saturday in October." "What day?" Margaret asked, and her voice had shifted into the decisive register she used when she was committing to something. "October 18th, I said. "Oh, I'll be there." She said, no hesitation, no qualification, no "I'll try" or "I'll see what I can do," just "I'll be there." "It's almost 3 hours from Charlottesville," I said. "Ray." Her voice was fond and slightly impatient, the tone Eleanor used to use when she thought I was being unnecessarily modest. "I have driven farther than that for worse reasons. Let me know where to park." I wrote 6 invitations by hand that afternoon. Not printed handwritten in the careful block letters I'd used my whole working life for parts orders and specifications, the only handwriting I had that was worth looking at. I addressed them to Daniel and Sarah, to Frank and Diane Mercer, and to 2 old friends from the plant who'd come to Eleanor's funeral and still checked in on me at Christmas. I drove to Daniel and Sarah's house that evening. Sarah answered the door in the middle of what looked like dinner preparation, an apron flower on one forearm, the warm smell of something baking drifting from behind her. "Dad," she said, smiling. "What a nice surprise. Come in." "I can't stay," I said. "I just wanted to drop these off." I held out the envelopes, Daniel's and Sarah's together, and the 2 for her parents rubber-banded to the side. "There's 1 for you and Daniel, and 2 for your folks. I wasn't sure of their address, so I thought you could pass them along." Sarah took them with both hands, glancing at the front. "What are these invitations?" I said. "I have a show, an art exhibition at the Millbrook Gallery, October 18th. I felt as I said it out loud to another human being a small warmth move through my chest. Pride, maybe, or something close to it. "Dad, that's wonderful." Sarah's smile was bright and genuine-looking. "Of course we'll be there. We wouldn't miss it." "It would mean a lot," I said. She was already turning back toward the kitchen, envelopes in hand. "Tell Daniel I said hi if you see him before I do," I added. "He'll be home by 8, she said over her shoulder. "I'll tell him tonight." I drove home with the windows down, even though the evening was cool enough that I probably should have put them up. I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been holding something until I let it go. The show felt real now in a way that it hadn't when it was only between me and the walls of the workshop. I made tea when I got home, and I sat at the kitchen table and I looked at the calendar on the wall. October 18th. 6 weeks. I circled the date with a red pen, the same date Eleanor had died 4 years ago. I had chosen it on purpose. Not to mourn, or not only to mourn, but because it seemed right that the day I'd been dreading every year should finally become something else. Something she would have stayed up late talking about. Something worth circling in red. I didn't hear back from Daniel that week. I told myself he was busy. People get busy. 3 days after I dropped off the invitations, my phone rang at 7:20 in the evening. Daniel's name on the screen. My stomach lifted the way it used to when he called regularly, that old reflex, the one that said, "Here he is, here's my son." I answered before the second ring. "Hey, Dad." His voice was upbeat, easy, the particular tone he used when he was calling with good news, or at least neutral news. No weight in it. No awareness of anything requiring acknowledgement. "Daniel," I said. "Good to hear from you." "Yeah, sorry, it's been a few weeks. Work has been insane." He launched into a brief summary of a project that had gone sideways and then righted itself, the kind of story that means a lot to the person telling it and lands gently on the listener. I made the right sounds. I waited. "So listen," he said, shifting gears with the casual ease of someone who doesn't know they're about to say something that will sit in another person's chest for weeks. "Sarah's parents, Frank and Diane, they've been wanting to do a big family trip. All of us together. They found this incredible resort in Cancun, all-inclusive, and the dates work out perfectly." His voice brightened. "We're thinking the third week of October. Should be amazing." My hand tightened around the phone. "What weekend exactly?" I asked, and I kept my voice even the way I'd learned to keep my voice even through 30 years of shop floor disagreements and insurance negotiations and the thousand small moments in a life where losing your composure costs you more than keeping it. "18th through the 22nd, Daniel said. 4 nights. Frank got a really good rate because he booked early." "The 18th. "Daniel," I said carefully. "Did you get my invitation?" A pause. Brief, but there. "What invitation, Dad?" My jaw tightened so hard I felt it in my back teeth. "I dropped off invitations at your house 3 days ago," I said. "I gave them to Sarah. There was one for you, one for Frank and Diane. I have the art show at Millbrook Gallery, October 18th. Another pause, longer this time. When Daniel spoke again, his voice had shifted. Not guilty, not defensive, just genuinely confused, the tone of a man trying to reconstruct a timeline he doesn't have all the pieces for. Dad, I didn't know about any invitations. Sarah didn't mention anything." "I see," I said. "But Dad, we already booked the flights. Frank paid the deposit on the whole package. I don't think we can—" "It's all right," I said. And I meant it in the way you mean something when meaning it is the only option that doesn't make everything worse. "Dad, I'm sorry. I genuinely didn't know." He sounded it. That was the part that made it harder, not easier, the sincerity in his voice, the confusion, the absence of any malice. He hadn't chosen the trip over my show. He hadn't known there was a choice. I called him again 2 weeks later. One more time, because I am a man who tries. He picked up from what sounded like a restaurant, voices and silverware in the background. "Hey, Dad, can I call you back in 20? I just wanted to remind you about the show," I said. October 18th. Millbrook Gallery. Opens at 9 in the morning, awards at 2 in the afternoon. Any part of it. Right. I could hear him smiling, the distracted warmth of someone managing 2 things at once. "I'll do my best, Dad. I'll really try." He didn't call back that night. I didn't follow up. I stood at the kitchen window after I'd set the phone down, looking out at the parking lot below, the orange glow of the streetlights just starting to come on in the early evening dark. My chest felt hollow in a way that was different from grief. Grief, I knew grief had a texture and a weight. This was something else. This was the specific ache of a man who had extended his hand and felt nothing close around it. I went into the workshop. I sat down at the wheel even though there was nothing left to make. I just put my hands on it, and let it spin slowly the way I had at the very beginning, before I knew what I was doing, when the motion itself was enough. There is a difference, I had learned, between telling yourself something doesn't matter and actually believing it. I was still working on the second part. I suspected I would be for a while. The 4th anniversary of Eleanor's passing fell on a Saturday, and I woke up at 4:53 in the morning without an alarm. I always do on this day. My body has decided, apparently, that October 18th is not a day for sleeping through, and after 4 years, I've stopped arguing with it. I lay in the dark for a few minutes, with my eyes open, listening to the buildings settle around me the way old buildings do. And I thought about Eleanor the way I always think about her in those first unguarded minutes of the day, not as absence but as presence. The shape of her. The sound of her voice when she was reading something that amused her, that low, surprised laugh she tried to suppress and couldn't. I got up. Made coffee. 1 cup this morning. I had made the decision the night before, deliberately, the way you make a decision about a habit you are trying to change. 1 cup, not 2. Today of all days, I was going to practice believing she wasn't coming back, because that was the honest thing, and Eleanor had always respected honesty more than comfort. The cemetery was 12 minutes from the apartment. I drove there in the early gray of a morning that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to be beautiful or merely overcast, and I parked in the small gravel lot near the east entrance and walked the familiar path to Eleanor's headstone with the bunch of yellow chrysanthemums I'd bought at the grocery store the evening before. She had grown them in our garden on Delwood Avenue for 15 years. She called them the sensible flower because they bloomed when everything else was dying. I crouched down and set the flowers against the base of the stone and pressed my palm flat against the granite for a moment, the way I always did. It was cold in that specific way of things that have been in the dark all night. 4 years, I said out loud. My voice sounded strange in the morning, quiet, too large for the space. I keep thinking it'll feel like longer. It doesn't. A sparrow landed on the top of a nearby stone and regarded me with the profound indifference only birds can manage. I finished them, I said to Eleanor. All 24. They accepted the submission I told you that I think. The show is today. I paused. I'm nervous, which you would find ridiculous. You'd say, Ray, what exactly are you nervous about? And I wouldn't have a good answer. My throat tightened the way it did sometimes, without warning, without my permission. I made you something. I made Daniel something too. I was going to give it to him tonight. I stopped, swallowed. I still might. We'll see how tonight goes. The sparrow flew away. The morning light was starting to come in low and gold from the east, catching the dew on the grass and turning it briefly luminous. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. A text from Margaret sent at 5:41 in the morning, already on the road. Stopped for gas in Waynesboro. There is a thermos of good coffee in my passenger seat, and I am not sharing it with anyone, so don't ask. See you at 10. I laughed out loud at Eleanor's headstone, a real laugh, the startled kind that comes from somewhere you weren't guarding. She's coming, I told Eleanor. Drove all the way from Charlottesville. I shook my head slowly. You always did know how to pick your people. I stood up, brushed the grass off my knees, and stood there for another minute with my hands in my coat pockets, looking at her name carved into the granite. Every year on this day I had called Daniel at 7 in the morning. It was our ritual. I'd call, he'd answer, we'd say her name together, and remember something about her, something specific and small, and then we'd hang up and carry the day separately. It was not a grand gesture, but it was ours. This year I did not call. Daniel was in Cancun. I knew this the way you know things you wish you didn't, the knowledge sitting low and heavy in the chest, not sharp anymore, just present. I wasn't angry. I had passed through angry somewhere around the second week of October and come out the other side into something quieter and more permanent. I was simply a man standing at his wife's grave on the morning of his art show, alone, in a way that was no longer a surprise. And I was choosing not to call his son, because a voice from a resort pool deck was not what this morning needed to be. I walked back to the car. The chrysanthemums were already bright against the gray stone, the sensible flower blooming when everything else was dying. I drove home. I showered. I pressed my collar flat in the bathroom mirror and looked at the face looking back at me, 68 years old, gray at the temples. The particular lines around the eyes that come from squinting in workshops and laughing at things your wife said and crying at things you couldn't change. Eleanor always said I cleaned up well. I straightened my collar and decided to believe her. I wrapped the blue bowl in soft cloth and carried it to the car like it was made of something irreplaceable. Because it was. I set it on the passenger seat and buckled the seatbelt around it, which would have made Eleanor laugh herself sideways, and then I sat for a moment, with both hands on the steering wheel before I started the engine. Okay, I said to no one in particular, to Eleanor, to whatever version of myself had started this 3.5 years ago in Deborah's Tuesday morning class, with shaking hands and no idea what he was doing. I drove to the gallery alone. I had done most things alone for 4 years. But that morning, for the first time, it felt like a choice that had been made for me rather than one I'd made myself. And there is a difference between those two things that is very hard to explain to someone who has never felt it. The Millbrook Community Gallery sat between a tax preparation office and a framing shop on the main commercial strip downtown. And if you weren't looking for it, you might walk past it twice before you noticed the hand-lettered sign in the window that said Annual Juried Exhibition, October 18th, in careful blue paint. I had been inside the gallery twice before, once for the submission appointment, once to drop off the pieces the previous week. But walking in that morning with the blue bowl under my arm felt different. The way walking into a place feels different when you belong to what's happening inside it. 12 artists, 43 pieces total. I set up my section along the north wall, 8 pieces on 2 small pedestals, and the remaining works on the shelves. The gallery had provided each piece with a small white card, handwritten in my block letters, with the title and a brief note. The blue bowl I placed on its own pedestal in the center, slightly forward from the rest, the way Deborah had suggested when I'd shown her photographs. "It's the anchor piece, Ray," she'd said, tapping the photo with one finger. "It wants to be seen first." By 9:30, the other artists were set up, and the doors had opened to the public, and the small space filled with the particular murmur of people doing their best to look at art thoughtfully. I stood near my section and tried to look like a man who was comfortable with strangers examining things he'd made in private. I was not particularly comfortable, but I was there. A retired schoolteacher named Harriet stopped to look at the burnt orange dish for a long time and told me her kitchen was that exact color and asked if it was for sale. I said yes. She bought it on the spot, paid cash, tucked it under her arm, with the careful pride of a woman who knows exactly what she wants and is pleased to have found it. That was the moment it stopped feeling like a test and started feeling like something real. I was talking to the artist in the adjacent section, a young woman named Clara, who made large abstract paintings in colors that made me feel slightly seasick, but in an interesting way, when I heard the door open behind me. I heard her before I saw her. The distinct rhythm of Margaret Ellison's walk, slightly uneven from the hip she refused to have properly treated, and the sound of her voice saying, "Excuse me," to someone in the doorway with the crisp authority of a woman who has places to be and will not be delayed. I turned around, and there she was. Margaret at 67 looked almost exactly like Margaret at 50. The same direct gaze, the same silver hair cut short and practical, the same posture that suggested she had been told her whole life to stand up straight and had simply decided to agree. She was wearing a blue blazer I recognized from the holidays at Eleanor's, and she was already scanning the room with the sharp attention of someone who has driven 3 hours and is going to make every minute of it count. Her eyes found me across the room, and her face broke into a smile so warm it made my chest hurt in the best possible way. "Ray Kowalski," she said, crossing to me with her arms already open. "Look at this place." I hugged her properly, both arms, the way Eleanor had always said I didn't do often enough. She smelled like coffee and the particular cedar soap she'd used for decades, and holding on to her felt absurdly like coming up for air. "You made it," I said, which was a ridiculous thing to say since she was visibly and physically present. But she understood what I meant. "Of course I made it," she said firmly, pulling back to look at my face with the assessing directness she'd inherited from decades of friendship with my wife. "You look tired, but good tired. The right kind." She turned to look at the shelves, and the change in her expression was immediate and profound. Her chin lifted, her eyes moved slowly from piece to piece, and the business-like efficiency drained out of her posture and left something softer in its place. She walked the section slowly. I followed a few steps behind and watched her look at 3.5 years of Tuesday and Thursday mornings with Eleanor's eyes and her own, and I did not say a word, because some moments do not require commentary. She stopped at the blue bowl, stood in front of it for a long time with her arms wrapped around herself, like she was trying to hold something in. "She told me," Margaret said, without turning around, her voice low and slightly unsteady, "about wanting to learn. About exactly this, the wheel, the clay, the feeling of making something with her hands." She paused. She described it to me. The shape of it. The color. She finally turned and her eyes were full and bright. "Ray, she dreamed about this exact piece. I don't know how else to say it. She dreamed about it." My throat locked shut so completely that I couldn't have answered her if I'd tried. I pressed my lips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then I looked back at Margaret, who was watching me with an expression I recognized, because Eleanor had worn it too, that look that said, "I see you, all of you, and I'm not going anywhere." "I know," I managed finally. "That's why I made them." The judging hadn't started yet. I went to get Margaret a cup of coffee from the refreshment table near the back, and when I returned, one of the 3 judges was standing in front of the blue bowl with her notebook open, writing something at length, pausing to look, and then writing again. Before I tell you what happened when they announced the winner, and trust me, the timing of what came next will hit you hard. Drop a number in the comments. Any number. Just let me know you're still here with Ray. A heads up, parts of this story include fictional elements for storytelling purposes. If that's not for you, no pressure to stay. The awards were announced at 2 in the afternoon, and by 1:50, the gallery had filled to a density I hadn't anticipated. Word had gotten around the way word gets around in small towns and close neighborhoods, through the kind of informal network that doesn't require social media or announcements, just people talking to other people over fences and in grocery lines. There were maybe 80 people crowded into a space designed comfortably for 50, and the temperature had risen noticeably, and someone near the refreshment table was laughing at something in that particular way. That means they've had 2 glasses of wine since noon. Margaret had claimed a spot near the left wall, close enough to the front to see clearly, but removed enough to have elbow room, which she had described to me as the only way to attend any public event. She had a plastic cup of sparkling water in one hand, and the expression of someone fully prepared to be partisan in a way that would embarrass me. "To stop hovering," she said, without looking at me when I drifted near her for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. "Go stand by your work. Look like you belong there." "I'm not sure I do," I said. She turned and pointed at me with her sparkling water. Raymond Kowalski, you have been making things with your hands for 68 years. That bowl over there would stop Eleanor's heart in the best possible way. Go stand by your work. I went and stood by my work. The gallery director, a compact, energetic woman named Patricia, who wore her reading glasses on a beaded chain and moved through the crowded room like she'd been born navigating it, stepped up to the small podium near the front and tapped the microphone twice. "Could I thank you all for being here," she said, and the room obliged by quieting itself. "We have 11 extraordinarily talented artists represented today, and our judges have had, I'm told, a genuinely difficult time of it, which is exactly what we hope for every year." Light laughter. I pressed my hands flat against my thighs and looked at the blue bowl on its pedestal and tried to breathe at a reasonable pace. In third place, Patricia announced, goes to Clara Hendricks for her piece titled August Revisited. Applause. Clara across the room covered her mouth with both hands and hugged the person next to her. Second place goes to William Okafor for Threshold. More applause. I clapped. My hands felt distant from my body like they belonged to someone who was handling the physical requirements of the moment, while I was somewhere slightly overhead watching. Patricia paused. She looked down at the card in her hand, then looked up at the room with the particular smile of someone who is about to say the thing everyone has gathered to hear. And that was the exact moment my phone began to vibrate in my jacket pocket. I felt it against my ribs, like a second heartbeat, insistent, rhythmic, impossible to ignore. I reached into my pocket without looking and turned the screen toward my palm. Through the fabric of my fingers, I could see the glow of the display. I didn't need to look at the name. I already knew. First place, Patricia said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room, goes to Raymond Kowalski for his piece titled I Pressed the Side Button. The vibrating stopped. Skuta. For the ones I made this life for. The applause started somewhere to my left and spread fast and through it, clear and distinct as a bell. I heard Margaret's voice rise above everyone else's. That's my friend. That is my friend right there. Her voice cracked on the last word in a way she would never have admitted to, and I heard her clapping with the dedicated force of someone making up for an entire absent family. I walked to the podium. Patricia shook my hand and pressed the award into my other hand, a framed certificate and a sealed envelope, and leaned close to say something I felt rather than heard over the applause. Something warm and genuine that landed in my chest and stayed there. I turned to face the room from the podium. 80 people looking at me, most of them strangers, a few familiar faces from the neighborhood or the community center, and Margaret near the left wall with her sparkling water raised like a toast, and her eyes absolutely shining. I thought about the voicemail I hadn't listened to yet. I thought about the specific weight of an unanswered phone in a quiet pocket. I thought about Eleanor at her headstone that morning, the yellow chrysanthemums bright against the gray. I said thank you. I said the work had started as something private and become something I hadn't expected. I said the person who had made it possible was not in the room, but that she was the reason for the title, and I left it at that because some things are not for 80 strangers and some things are not for no one. And the line between those two categories is something you learn by living long enough. After the ceremony, a young man with a press badge introduced himself as a reporter for the Millbrook Courier and asked if he could ask me a few questions. I said yes. He asked about my background, the machinist work, the 3.5 years of classes, the decision to enter the show. He asked about the Blue Bowl specifically. Who inspired that piece? He asked his pen ready. I looked at the bowl on its pedestal. The room had loosened into post-ceremony conversation around us, but I stood very still for a moment, long enough that the reporter glanced up from his notebook to check that I was still there. My wife, I said. She never got to make anything with her hands, so I made everything with mine. He wrote it down. He thanked me. I shook his hand. I found Margaret waiting for me near the door 20 minutes later, my coat over her arm and her own bag on her shoulder, ready to leave with the efficient calm of a woman who has accomplished what she came to do. In the parking lot, I finally took out my phone and listened to Daniel's voicemail. "Hey Dad, just checking in. Having a great time down here, weather's incredible. Hope your little show is going well. Give me a call when you get a chance." I stood in the parking lot with the phone against my ear and the October air cold on my face, and I listened to it twice. Then I put the phone in my pocket and stood there for a long time before I found the key to my car. Margaret chose the restaurant, a diner called Patsy's, 2 blocks from the gallery that she had identified during her pre-arrival research, with the thoroughness of a woman who leaves nothing to chance. "It has pie," she said, as though this settled all questions of venue, and since I had no objection to pie and no energy left for opinions, I followed her in. We took the corner booth. A waitress named Donna, who wore her hair in a braid and moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who has worked the same Saturday shift for a decade, brought menus and coffee without being asked. "Bless her," Margaret said sincerely, wrapping both hands around the mug. I ordered coffee and a bowl of soup I mostly didn't eat. Margaret ordered a slice of apple pie that she ate with the focused appreciation of someone who had driven nearly 3 hours and earned it. We talked about the drive, the construction on I-64, the podcast she'd been listening to, about the history of American roadside diners, the rest stop in Staunton, where the vending machine had taken her dollar and given her nothing in return, and she had taken it personally. I stood there for a full minute," she said, pointing at me with her fork, "just staring at it, like it was going to reconsider." I laughed. The laugh surprised me, loose and genuine, the kind that comes from a place below whatever tension I'd been carrying all day. It was the first real laugh since the one at the cemetery that morning, and it felt like releasing a fist I hadn't known I was making. Margaret watched me with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has achieved a specific goal. Then she set down her fork and looked at me with the directness she never bothered to soften. "You're not telling me something," she said. I looked at my coffee. "You sound like her." "I'll take that." She folded her hands on the table. "What is it? I had been carrying it for 3 weeks. The kind of carrying that gets heavier the longer you go without setting it down. And about a month ago, I said, I went to see Gerald Holt." I watched Margaret's face for recognition. "My attorney. I've used him since we bought the Delwood house 30-some years." "I remember Eleanor mentioning him," Margaret said carefully. "Go on." "I asked him to help me set up a foundation." I wrapped my hands around my mug. "A scholarship fund. For arts education students who can't afford it. Private lessons, summer programs, community college courses." I paused. "I want to name it after Eleanor." Margaret held very still for a moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over mine, and the warmth of it went straight through me like something I hadn't realized I was cold without. "Ray," she said quietly. "Gerald had been working on the structure for 3 weeks," I said. "A donor-advised fund through the Community Foundation. That's the legal vehicle. It qualifies as a charitable organization under Section 501(c)(3) of the tax code, which means the contributions are tax-deductible and the money is protected and managed properly." I paused. "Tonight after dinner, I'm going to sign the final transfer documents. Gerald messengered them to my apartment yesterday." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Does Daniel know he will, Auntie?" I said. She searched my face. "And the bowl, the one you made for him?" I looked at my soup. "He didn't come tonight." "I know," she said gently. I'm still going to give it to him, I said, when the time is right. She nodded slowly, the way she nodded when she was accepting something she didn't entirely like. Then she picked up her fork again and cut into the last piece of her pie. What about the other pieces? She asked. The gallery sold some tonight, I assume. Harriet bought the orange dish, I said. 2 others sold during the show. I turned my coffee mug in my hands. A woman named Linda Voss introduced herself after the ceremony. She's a curator from the State Arts Museum in Richmond. She asked about the collection. Margaret's fork paused mid-bite. Asked about it how she wants to acquire it, I said. The remaining pieces, for the permanent collection. I watched Margaret's expression move through surprise and into something that looked like Eleanor's particular brand of vindicated pride, the expression Eleanor used when something she believed in was proven right. She gave me her card. We're going to talk next week, Ray. Margaret's voice had gone soft. Eleanor would be... She stopped, started again. She would be so loud about this. You know that, right? She would call everyone she knew. My throat tightened. I know, I said. That's why I am telling you instead. You're the closest thing. Margaret pressed her lips together hard for a moment, composing herself with visible effort. Then she lifted her coffee mug. To Eleanor, she said. I lifted mine. To Eleanor. We drove in separate cars to my apartment building afterward. Margaret waited in the parking lot while I went upstairs, and I stood at my kitchen table and opened the envelope Gerald had messengered and read through all 11 pages the way Gerald had told me to, carefully, every line. And then I picked up the pen and signed my name in the 3 places marked with a small yellow tab. Eleanor Marie Kowalski Arts Scholarship Fund. Established October 18, 2025. I put the cap back on the pen and set it down. Outside my kitchen window, the maple in the courtyard had gone full orange in the dark, the color Eleanor used to call ridiculous and magnificent in the same breath. I put the signed documents back in the envelope and set the blue bowl on the kitchen table beside them. It sat there in the lamplight, the 2 names on the interior base invisible from where I stood, but present the way important things are present even when you can't see them. I went downstairs and told Margaret it was done. She hugged me in the parking lot under the orange tree, and I held on, and neither of us said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. She drove back to Charlottesville. I went upstairs and went to bed. I did not sleep for a long time. They landed on a Tuesday afternoon, and Daniel called me from the airport while they were waiting for their luggage. I was in the kitchen making a late lunch when the phone rang, a grilled cheese sandwich I'd been looking forward to in the specific way you look forward to small, reliable things when larger things have become unreliable. I turned the burner down and answered, "Dad, hey." His voice had that particular looseness that comes from a week of warm weather and no obligations relaxed in a way that people get when they've been somewhere that required nothing of them. Just landed. Crazy flight, we got rerouted through Atlanta, but we made it. Glad you're back safe, I said. Cancun was unbelievable, Dad. You should see the water down there, this color blue you wouldn't believe exists outside of a painting. He laughed easy and warm. Frank got us these cabana chairs right on the beach. We basically didn't move for 4 days. I pressed the spatula flat against the sandwich and watched it brown. That sounds nice, I said. It was exactly what we needed. A pause, the sound of an airport PA system in the background. Sarah's voice saying something I couldn't make out. Then Daniel's voice came back, slightly shifted in register. Hey, Dad, I just checked the account. Did something happen with the transfer this month? The transfer. Direct deposit first of every month, the arrangement Sarah had proposed 2 years ago, with her elbows on the patio table and her eyes full of concern. Nothing happened, I said. I stopped it. The airport noise continued in the background. Daniel's voice went carefully still. You stopped it. That's right. Dad, what? He caught himself. Recalibrated. Is everything okay? Are you having financial problems? Because if you need... I don't need anything, I said. I stopped it because I decided to stop it. That's all. A longer pause. I heard him exhale through his nose the particular sound he made when he was working to keep his voice level. Can we come over today when we get in? You can come over whenever you'd like, I said. You know that. He said they'd be there by 4. I finished my sandwich, ate it standing at the counter, and then I went into the workshop and sat in the chair by the window and looked at the empty shelves where 23 pieces had been before Linda Voss's assistant had come with a van and careful packing materials on Thursday. The blue bowl was still on the kitchen table where I'd left it the night of the show. I'd moved it there every morning and moved it back to the workshop every evening, like I couldn't decide where it belonged yet. Daniel knocked at 3:58. Sarah was behind him. She had the look of someone who had spent a 10-hour travel day constructing her composure and was fairly satisfied with the result. Hair neat, expression calibrated to something between concern and calm, the particular blankness of a face that is performing neutrality rather than feeling it. Daniel looked tired in the honest way of a man who had slept badly on a red-eye connection and hadn't bothered to hide it. Dad. Daniel stepped in, squeezed my shoulder, looked around the apartment with the quick sweep of someone checking for evidence. His eyes landed on the workshop doorway, the empty shelves visible from the hall. He blinked. Where is everything? Sold, I said. Sarah's head turned toward the workshop so fast I heard her earrings move. Sold. Her voice was sharp at the edges before she smoothed it. All of it. 23 pieces, I said. A curator from the State Arts Museum came on Thursday. Daniel turned back to me. Dad, that's great. He meant it. I could hear it, but there was something running underneath the words. Something that had been running since the airport phone call and hadn't resolved itself yet. Can we sit down? We sat. Sarah took the chair nearest the door. Daniel sat on the couch and leaned forward with his forearms on his knees, the posture he'd had since childhood, when he was working up to something difficult. I need to understand what's happening, he said. The transfer, the everything. Walk me through it. The transfer stopped because I chose to stop it, I said. It was my money. I'm allowed to stop sending it. Of course you are, Daniel said quickly. This isn't about the money itself, Dad. It's about not knowing. We came home to a stopped payment, and you weren't answering my calls Saturday, and I didn't know if you were sick or... I wasn't sick, I said. I was at my show. The words landed in the room and stayed there. Daniel's jaw tightened. He pressed his hands together between his knees and stared at the floor for a moment. Dad, he said carefully. I'm sorry about the show. I genuinely didn't know about the invitations until you mentioned them on the phone. Sarah said she never... He glanced at her. Sarah had gone very still in her chair. I gave 6 invitations to Sarah. I said, keeping my voice level, and even the way I'd kept it through 30 years of moments that required it. 6 weeks before the show, I handed them to her personally at your front door. I looked at Daniel, not at Sarah. One was addressed to you. Daniel turned to look at his wife. Sarah uncrossed and recrossed her legs. I must have put them somewhere and forgotten, she said. Her voice was smooth and unhurried, the voice of a woman who had prepared for this specific sentence. I've been so overwhelmed with the trip planning, Dad. I'm so sorry. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when everyone in them knows that something has just been said that isn't true. I picked up my phone from the coffee table. I opened the photos, the picture I'd taken the afternoon I wrote the invitations, all 6, laid out on the kitchen table in 2 neat rows. Each one addressed in my block letters, the Millbrook Gallery return address, printed in the corner. I turned the screen to face Daniel and set it on the coffee table between us without a word. He picked it up. He looked at the photo for a long time. Then he looked up at his wife with an expression I recognized from when he was 9 years old and had broken something he hadn't meant to break and knew it, and couldn't figure out how to say so. Sarah was looking at the window. Daniel set my phone down on the coffee table with the careful deliberateness of someone buying time. Sarah had not moved her gaze from the window. There was something almost architectural about the stillness of her face, the way a building looks right before an engineer tells you there are structural problems you can't see from the outside. I don't understand, Daniel said, and his voice had lost the practiced evenness it had held since he walked in. It was raw now, slightly rough at the edges. Sarah, did you know about the show the whole time? Daniel, she started. 6 envelopes, he said. He picked up my phone and looked at the photo again, like looking at it a second time might resolve something the first look hadn't. All 6 of them. He handed them to you. His voice climbed slightly on the last sentence, not accusatory, yet still in the territory of someone trying to understand something that doesn't make sense. Sarah turned from the window. I told him I'd forgotten where I put them, she said. That's the truth. Her voice was even and firm, the tone that meant the sentence was finished, and she didn't intend to add to it. The air in the room thickened. I stood up. I'll get some water, I said, because I wanted to give Daniel a moment, because watching your own marriage rearrange itself in real time requires privacy that I had no business interrupting. I went to the kitchen, took my time at the tap, looked at the blue bowl on the table and thought about Eleanor, and thought about Daniel's face when he looked at that photo, and thought about the particular loneliness of understanding something about the person you love that you'd rather not understand. I came back with 2 glasses of water and set them on the coffee table and sat back down. Daniel was on his phone. He wasn't looking at Sarah. His thumb was moving fast across the screen in the way people move through search results when they're looking for something specific and slightly dreading finding it. Then he stopped. His face changed so completely and so quickly that I felt it from across the coffee table, a full body shift, shoulders dropping, chin coming up, the color draining from his face and then rushing back in all at once. His lips parted. He stared at the screen. Sarah leaned slightly toward him. What? He didn't answer her. He turned the phone around and held it out to me, the screen facing my direction. The Millbrook Courier website. A photograph I hadn't known was being taken me at the podium, the framed certificate in one hand, the sealed envelope in the other, and the expression on my face that I never would have been able to describe, but that Daniel was apparently looking at now with the focused intensity of a man seeing something for the first time that had been there all along. The headline read, "Retired Machinist Wins Top Prize at Millbrook Arts Show." Dad, Daniel said, and his voice had gone somewhere very quiet. You won. First place, I said. He looked back at the screen. I watched his eyes move as he read the article, the quote from Patricia about the quality of the submission, and then the paragraph about the blue bowl. I knew which paragraph it was because his breathing changed when he reached it. A blue ceramic bowl. He read aloud, his voice unsteady. Titled "For the Ones I Made This Life," for featuring 2 names inscribed on the interior base. When asked about the inspiration for the piece, Kowalski said, "My wife. She never got to make anything with her hands. So I made everything with mine." He stopped reading. He lowered the phone slowly until it was resting on his knee. 2 names, he said. He wasn't asking. "You know one of them," I said. Daniel's throat worked. He set the phone on the cushion beside him and pressed both hands flat on his thighs, and I watched him do the thing I'd watched him do since he was a small boy, trying not to cry in front of me. The jaw set, the breath drawn in carefully through the nose, the deliberate steadying of something that badly wanted to come apart. Sarah had gone absolutely rigid in her chair. Her face had shifted into something I hadn't seen on her before. Not the smooth composure she maintained for difficult conversations. Not the bright warmth she deployed when she needed something. Something underneath both of those. Something that looked, if I was reading it right, very much like the expression of a person who has just watched a calculation go catastrophically wrong. How much did you win?" she asked. Her voice was controlled and precise. "The prize money." The question dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Daniel turned to look at his wife with the slowness of a man who is registering for the first time the full weight of what he is looking at. I looked at Sarah. She met my eyes directly, which I gave her credit for even now. "Enough," I said. I stood up and went to the kitchen for no particular reason, except that I needed to move. I heard Sarah's voice behind me, low and rapid, and Daniel's answering voice, lower still. I ran water over my hands at the sink and looked out the window at the parking lot below, and thought about how a week on a beach in Cancun had cost someone something they didn't know they were spending until it was already gone. Behind me, the conversation between my son and his wife had gone very quiet. That particular kind of quiet that isn't peaceful. 2 days after Daniel and Sarah left my apartment, I was in the workshop doing nothing in particular, running a cloth over the empty shelves, the way you clean things that don't need cleaning, just to have somewhere to put your hands, when my phone rang. "Margaret," I answered on the first ring. "Ray." Her voice had that particular quality it got when she was choosing her words with more care than usual, not slow. Margaret was never slow, but deliberate in a way that told me she was about to say something she'd spent time deciding how to say. "I need to tell you something, and I want you to hear it before you decide how to feel about it." "Go ahead," I said. I set the cloth down on the shelf and moved to the chair by the window. "You know Linda Calloway? She lives 3 houses down from me on Birchwood." I didn't know Linda Calloway, but I said I knew of her. "Her husband works at Feldman and Associates," Margaret said. "The law firm on Commerce Street, the one that does estate work and family law." She paused. "Linda mentioned to me this morning that Sarah Kowalski came in 2 days ago. Yesterday, actually. She was asking questions about guardianship." The word landed in the room and sat there. I had heard of guardianship petitions, had in fact discussed them with Gerald Holt in the abstract years ago when we were updating estate documents. A guardianship petition in the state of Virginia was a legal process by which a court could appoint someone to make decisions on behalf of a person deemed unable to make sound decisions for themselves. It required a petitioner with legal standing, a medical evaluation, a court hearing, and a judge's determination. It was not a small thing. It was not something filed lightly. It was also, I knew, not something a daughter-in-law could file on her own. "Did Linda say what specifically she was asking about?" I said. My voice came out level, and even, which surprised me because what I felt was not level or even. What I felt was the particular cold clarity that comes when something you suspected but hoped was wrong turns out to be exactly as wrong as you feared. Conservatorship and guardianship options, Margaret said. How to establish that a family member is her word according to Linda struggling to manage on his own. She paused again, and I could hear her steadying herself. Ray, I'm so sorry. I debated whether to tell you. You were right to tell me, I said. Are you all right? I looked around the workshop, the empty shelves, the wheel in the corner, the photograph of Eleanor beside the window. I'm fine, I said. I need to make a call. I called Gerald Holt the moment I hung up with Margaret. He picked up himself, which he usually did when it was my number, a courtesy he extended to clients he'd known for decades. Gerald, I said. I have a situation I need to think through with you. I explained what Margaret had told me. There was a brief silence on Gerald's end, the silence of a lawyer processing information rather than reacting to it, which I had always found reassuring. Okay, he said when I'd finished. First thing, a daughter-in-law has no independent legal standing to file a guardianship or conservatorship petition in Virginia. She would need your son to be the petitioner of record. Without Daniel's signature on the filing, it goes nowhere. She'd have to convince him, I said. She'd have to convince him, Gerald confirmed. And even then, the bar is not low. The court requires a comprehensive medical evaluation by a licensed physician, documented evidence of incapacity or inability to manage personal affairs, and a hearing where you would have full opportunity to respond and present your own evidence. It's not a phone call and a signature. It's a process, and it's one where you'd have ample notice and counsel. What about the fund? I asked. The scholarship documents we signed. Already recorded with the Community Foundation, Gerald said, and I heard the particular satisfaction in his voice that he got when paperwork was airtight. The assets transferred on the 19th. There is nothing in your personal estate that could be characterized as mismanaged. Ray, you made a legal, documented, charitable gift with full capacity witnessed and notarized. If someone wanted to argue you were incapable of managing your affairs, they'd have a hard time explaining why your affairs are in fact in excellent order. I let that settle for a moment. The cold clarity was still there, but something else was moving through it now. Not quite relief, not quite anger. Something steadier than either. Gerald, I said, is there anything else we should put in place? I'd recommend we update your healthcare directive and confirm your durable power of attorney is current, he said. Not because anything's urgent, but because documentation is the best answer to anyone who wants to question your judgment. We make it so thorough that the question answers itself. Set it up, I said. Whatever you need from me. I'll call you Thursday, Gerald said. And Ray, whoever is asking these questions, they're not going to find what they're looking for. You've done everything right. I thanked him and hung up. I sat in the workshop chair for a long time after that. The afternoon light was coming through the east window at the low angle it got in late October, falling across the empty shelves, and the wheel and the photograph of Eleanor and I thought about a woman who had called me Dad within 2 months of meeting me, and sat across from me asking about Eleanor with both eyes on me like she was actually storing the answers somewhere useful. I had liked her. That was the part that sat heaviest, not the anger, not the cold clarity, but the simple, tired weight of having been wrong about someone I'd wanted to be right about. I thought about Daniel's face in my living room 2 days ago. The way he'd looked at his wife when she said she'd forgotten where she put the invitations. The way a person looks when they're watching something rearrange itself and can't stop it. I did not call Daniel. I did not call Sarah. I did not warn anyone that I knew what was being planned, because the thing about knowing what someone intends to do before they do it is that you can choose how to receive it. I had already signed the papers. Gerald had already filed them. There was nothing left to protect, because everything that mattered was already protected. I went to the kitchen and made coffee and sat at the table with the blue bowl across from me, and I waited. Some things you have to let come to you. The ones who need to move fast always tip their hand, and I had never in 68 years been a man who moved fast. I was a man who waited until the clay was ready. You could not rush it. Every time I'd tried, the piece had collapsed in my hands. She knocked on a Thursday morning, 3 days after she and Daniel had sat in my living room and watched everything begin to unravel. 2 knocks soft and measured the kind of knock that is designed to sound tentative, but comes from a person who is anything but. I'd heard that knock before at the front door of Daniel's house, the way she'd knocked before opening it herself. The choreography of deference from someone who had already decided what was going to happen next. I opened the door. Sarah stood in the hallway in a gray sweater and dark jeans, no blazer, minimal makeup. Her hair down instead of pulled back the way she usually wore it when she was in performance mode. She had constructed with considerable skill the appearance of a woman who had cried recently and was bravely holding herself together. Her eyes were slightly pink at the rims. Her chin was level. "Dad," she said, and her voice was soft and carefully worn at the edges like something that had been used for comfort recently. I was hoping we could talk. "Come in," I said. I stepped back. She walked into the apartment and stood in the middle of the living room, the way she always stood in rooms, taking inventory with her eyes. Before she chose her seat, the habit of a woman who liked to understand the geography before she committed to a position. She sat in the armchair nearest the window. I sat on the couch across from her. "Dad," she began, and she leaned forward slightly, hands folded between her knees, eyes holding mine with the particular warmth of someone who has practiced this specific expression. "I owe you an apology. I owe you more than that, actually, but I want to start there." "Go ahead," I said. "The invitations." She pressed her lips together, shook her head slowly, the gesture of a woman confronting her own failure with the appropriate gravity. "I should have given them to Daniel immediately. I put them down and got caught up in the trip planning, and I dropped the ball, Dad. There's no excuse for it, and I'm so sorry you were alone that night." Her eyes filled, not overflowing, just full enough to be visible, just enough to cost her something. I've been sick about it. I looked at her hands folded together between her knees. They were perfectly steady. "That's kind of you to say, Sarah," I said. She looked at me with an expression that was clearly hoping for more. An opening, a reciprocal softening, some indication that the apology had landed and the temperature in the room was dropping. When I didn't provide it, she adjusted her approach with the smoothness of someone accustomed to adjusting. "I want to make it right," she said. "Whatever that looks like, Dad. Daniel and I both do. We want to be more present. We want to—" She stopped, took a breath that was meant to look effortful. "We want to understand what you're planning, with the money from the museum and whatever decisions you're making, so we can support you." Her voice had gone softer still, the particular register she used when she wanted to sound like she was asking rather than asking for something. "We're your family. We want to be involved." I looked at her for a long moment. She held my gaze steadily, which I respected even now. She was not a woman who looked away. "Sarah," I said, "I know about Feldman and Associates." The room did not change in any way that a camera would have captured. No sharp intake of breath, no visible flinch, no dramatic collapse of expression. But something shifted behind her eyes, something small and precise like a door closing very quietly in a large house. Her hands still folded between her knees tightened almost imperceptibly. Almost. I don't know what you mean, she said. Her voice was even and immediate, the response of someone who had prepared for this sentence and was delivering it on cue. I think you do, I said. But it doesn't matter either way. I stood up and I walked to the bookcase beside the kitchen doorway, where I had placed the envelope that morning when I woke up, and decided quietly and without drama that today was the day. I picked it up and brought it back to the coffee table and set it down in front of her. Gerald Holt prepared these documents, I said. Gerald has handled my legal affairs for 31 years. This is the establishment of the Eleanor Marie Kowalski Arts Scholarship Fund. The transfer of assets was completed on October 19th. I sat back down across from her. I signed it the night of the show. The night you were at the resort in Cancun. Sarah reached forward and picked up the envelope. She opened it with steady hands and removed the documents, all 11 pages, the Community Foundation letterhead, Gerald's signature beside mine, the notary stamp on the final page. She read with the focused attention of someone looking for something specific, turning pages with controlled efficiency, her face absolutely composed. She reached the last page, set it back in the envelope, set the envelope on the coffee table with a care that was almost gentle. "Dad," she said, and her voice had changed, not broken, not angry, something quieter and more considered than either. "I hope you know that Daniel and I only ever wanted to—" "I know what you wanted, Sarah," I said. Not unkindly, not loudly, just clearly the way you state a fact that doesn't require elaboration. And I want you to know that I don't hold it against you. I folded my hands in my lap and looked at her across the coffee table. But I need you to understand something. I am 68 years old. I built a life for 40 years with a woman I loved more than I have words for. I learned to make things with my hands because she never got the chance to. I gave away everything that could be taken except the one thing I made for my son. I paused. I am not a man who needs managing. Sarah looked at me for a long moment. The composure was still there. She would not give it up entirely. It was too much a part of her, but something around the edges of it had shifted. Something that might, in a different version of this conversation, have become something real. She stood up. She picked up her bag from the floor beside the chair. "Thank you for seeing me, Dad," she said. "Of course," I said. I walked her to the door. She left without looking back, her footsteps even, and unhurried down the hallway, and I stood in the doorway and listened until I heard the elevator open and close. And then I went back inside and sat down at the kitchen table across from the blue bowl and put my hands flat on the table and breathed. She had held the documents for exactly as long as it took to understand that there was nothing left to do. That was, I supposed, something. I don't know exactly what happened in that house after Sarah came home Thursday morning. I know Daniel called me at 6:52 Friday because I was awake when the phone rang, and I looked at the clock before I answered the way you look at a clock when you already know something is coming, and you want to remember exactly when it arrived. "Dad." His voice was not the voice he'd used at the airport, loose and warm from a week of sun. It was stripped down to something I hadn't heard in years, not since the hospital hallway the night Eleanor died, not since he was a boy who had broken something he couldn't fix and needed to tell me. I found the invitations. I sat up slowly in bed and put my feet on the floor. Outside the window, the sky was the particular dark gray of 6 in the morning in November, the kind of sky that hasn't decided yet whether it intends to offer anything. I said nothing. I waited for him to continue because the words he was carrying needed to come out in his own order, not mine. "I was looking for the insurance card," he said. "The car insurance, it was up for renewal, and I couldn't find the card anywhere, and Sarah was still asleep, and I was going through the nightstand looking for it." His voice caught slightly hitched on something and pushed through. I opened the wrong drawer, the one on her side. He stopped. Daniel, I said quietly. All 6 of them, Dad. His voice cracked open on the word 6 in a way that he clearly hadn't intended and couldn't pull back. All 6 still in the envelopes, still sealed. One of them had my name on it, in your handwriting. It was right there under her. She had a magazine on top of them. His breath came in uneven and went out the same way the breathing of a man walking very carefully across ground he has just discovered is not solid. She put a magazine on top of them. I pressed my hand flat against my knee and looked at the gray window and thought about 6 envelopes addressed in my block letters, sitting in a drawer under a magazine for 6 weeks, while my son was told there were no invitations to receive. Dad, why didn't you just tell me? His voice had gone ragged at the edges now, not crying, but adjacent to it, the sound of someone fighting hard to stay on the right side of a line. When I said I didn't know about any invitations, why didn't you say you gave them to her? I would have... He stopped, started again. I would have asked her directly. I would have made her answer me. Would it have changed anything? I said. I kept my voice gentle because the question was not a challenge. It was a real question, the one I'd been turning over since the moment I saw Sarah's eyes slide toward the window in my living room. You already had tickets, Daniel. You already had the hotel, the flights. Frank had already paid the deposit. If I'd told you I gave the invitations to Sarah and you'd asked her and she'd said she forgot, what would you have done? A long silence on the other end. Not the silence of a man who doesn't have an answer, the silence of a man who does and doesn't like it. I don't know, he said finally, and his voice had gone very quiet. I know you don't, I said. That's why I didn't say it that way. He breathed for a moment. I heard him swallow, heard him pull himself back from wherever the edge of that conversation had taken him. Dad, I'm sorry. The words came out thick and imperfect, the way apologies come out when they mean something, rather than when they're performed. I'm so sorry about that night, about the show, about the past. He stopped. About a lot of things. I know, I said. I should have. I knew you had the workshop. I knew you'd been doing something in there for years, and I never once asked you to show me. His voice broke fully on the word show, and he didn't try to recover it this time. You won first place, Dad. You won first place, and I wasn't there, and I found out from a newspaper. A sound escaped him that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, and landed somewhere painful between them. A newspaper. I felt something move through my chest that I didn't have a precise name for, not quite forgiveness, because forgiveness implies a debt, and I wasn't sure that was the right frame. Something more like recognition. The recognition of my son, the real one, the one who had called me every night at 7:30 for 3 months, the one who had cried in the hospital hallway with his whole body. He was still in there. He'd just been somewhere I couldn't reach him for a while. Come over, I said. Not today. Whenever you're ready. Take your time. I'll come tomorrow, he said without hesitating. Okay, I said. Dad. His voice had gone very still again. What do I do about Sarah? I looked at the window. The sky had made its decision. It was going to be gray all day. The flat, honest gray of a November that doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is. That's between you and Sarah, I said. I mean that. It's not my answer to give. I know, he said. He stopped again. I just needed to hear your voice. I'm here, I said, and I sat with him on the phone for another few minutes, neither of us saying anything in particular, just the sound of breathing and the occasional shift of a body finding a more comfortable position in an uncomfortable morning. Sometimes that is enough. Sometimes that is, in fact, everything. He came 2 days later. Without Sarah, he knocked on a Saturday afternoon, and I heard his car in the lot before he knocked the particular engine sound of his Subaru, the one that needed a belt replaced, and had needed it for 6 months. A fact I had mentioned twice, and decided not to mention again. Some things a father learns to let go of. I opened the door before his hand came down for the second knock. He looked terrible in the honest way that people look terrible when they've been through something real and haven't bothered to hide it. 3 days of stubble eyes that had been sleeping badly, the particular tightness around the mouth of someone who has been having hard conversations, or not having them, and isn't sure which is worse. He was wearing a jacket I recognized from 3 Christmases ago, the one Eleanor had given him, dark green wool, and the sight of it hit me somewhere I hadn't expected. "Hey, Dad," he said. His voice was rough and quiet, like something that had been used hard recently. "Come in," I said. "I just made coffee." He came in and sat at the kitchen table, not the couch, not the chair Sarah had chosen by the window, but the kitchen table, the place where we had eaten 1,000 meals and argued about nothing important, and sat in comfortable silence after Eleanor went to bed. The choice felt deliberate, like returning somewhere specific. I poured 2 cups and set one in front of him. He wrapped both hands around it the way his mother used to, like it was something to hold on to, and looked at the surface of the coffee for a moment before he looked up at me. "I brought the invitations," he said. He reached into the inside pocket of the green jacket and pulled out 6 envelopes slightly bent at the corners from being carried next to his body. He set them on the table between us, one slightly overlapping the next, all 6 of them in a row. He smoothed them flat with the palm of his hand, carefully, unnecessarily, the way hands move when they need something to do, while the mouth figures out what to say. "Dad, I've been trying for 3 days to figure out how to start this conversation," he said. He lifted his eyes to mine. They were red at the rims, not freshly, but chronically, the redness of someone who has been fighting with sleep for several nights running. "I keep getting stuck on the same thing." "What thing?" I said. "That I knew." His jaw worked. "Not about the invitations. I didn't know about those. I swear to you I didn't. But I knew about the show. You told me on the phone back in September, and I said I'd try and I didn't try, and I told myself that was about the trip and the timing and Frank's deposit." He pressed his lips together hard. "But that's not what it was about." "What was it about?" I said. He looked at me with the directness that had always been the best thing about him. The quality Eleanor used to call his saving grace, the inability to sustain a dishonest answer when someone asked him a straight question. "I let Sarah decide how much attention I paid to things," he said. "I let her tell me what mattered, and I stopped asking my own questions. And somewhere in there," his voice dropped, "somewhere in there you stopped being someone I checked on and started being something I managed. And I hate that." His eyes filled, and this time he didn't fight it. 2 tears tracked down his face, and he let them go, pressing the back of his hand against his mouth. "You're my dad. You're not a situation." My throat closed. I picked up my coffee and took a sip I didn't taste and set it back down. "I know you didn't know about the drawer," I said. "I knew that when you looked at Sarah in my living room. I could see it. You weren't performing confusion, Daniel. You were confused. There's a difference, and I know the difference." He nodded, wiping his face with the back of his hand with the unself-conscious roughness of a man who has decided not to be dignified about this particular moment. "Good." Dignity was not what this moment needed. "I missed your show," he said. I missed Mom's anniversary, and you sat in that gallery alone and won first place and came home and signed away your money to a scholarship fund that I didn't know existed, and you didn't call me angry, you didn't." He stopped. "You just waited." "How did you just wait, Dad?" "Because I knew you'd come," I said. "Eventually, you always come." He looked at me for a moment, his face doing something complicated that I recognized, because Eleanor's face had done the same thing in moments of being understood, that involuntary, almost pained expression of being seen more clearly than you expected. I pushed back from the table, walked to the kitchen counter where the blue bowl had been sitting since I brought it from the workshop that morning, wrapped in the soft cloth I used for the finished pieces. I picked it up and carried it back to the table and set it in front of Daniel. "Open it," I said. He unwrapped the cloth slowly, the way you unwrap something you already sense is important. The blue glaze caught the afternoon light from the kitchen window and held it that deep, uneven blue, the color of the sky, in the minutes before full dark. He turned it in his hands, feeling the weight of it, the texture of the exterior where I'd left the clay slightly rough by intention. Then he turned it over. He saw the names on the interior base. He went very still, not the architectural stillness of Sarah reading the legal documents, but the stillness of a person who has been struck somewhere soft and is absorbing it. "Eleanor." He read his voice barely above a breath. "Daniel." He looked up at me and his eyes were full and spilling over, and he made no effort whatsoever to stop it. "Dad, I made it for you," I said. "I was going to give it to you the night of the show." I sat back down across from him. "It's yours. It always was." He held the bowl against his chest with both arms, the way you hold something you are afraid of dropping. And he bent his head over it, and his shoulders shook once, twice, the deep, involuntary shaking of a man releasing something he has been carrying for longer than he knew. I put my hand on his arm and left it there. Outside the kitchen window, the maple in the courtyard had dropped most of its leaves. The branches were bare and clean against the pale November sky, the way things look after they've let go of everything they were holding. Before he left, Daniel stood at the door with the bowl tucked carefully under one arm and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face in years, open and a little lost, and very much like the boy who had handed me tools on Saturday mornings because he believed his father knew what he was doing. "What happens now, Dad?" he asked. "With everything? What are you going to do?" I looked at him, my son holding something I had made with my hands, and I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. "I've been thinking about that," I said. "I think I finally have an answer." The answer had been there for a while. I just hadn't let myself say it out loud until Daniel asked. The house on Delwood Avenue had been sold 2 years ago to a couple from Columbus, a young family, 2 kids, a dog that the real estate agent mentioned, unprompted, as though it were a selling point. They had repainted the kitchen, which I knew because I had driven past it exactly once in 2 years, slowly the way you drive past a thing you're not ready to look at directly. The yellow Eleanor had spent 3 weeks choosing was gone. The new color was white, practical and clean and completely correct, and entirely wrong. They moved to Phoenix 18 months in. Job transfer, the agent told me when I called a motivated seller situation, which in real estate language means someone who needs this done quickly and is willing to be reasonable about the price. I called Gerald first. "Ray," he said, and I could hear him setting something down on his desk, giving me his full attention, in the way he did when he sensed the call was going to matter. "What can I do for you?" "The Delwood house," I said. "It's back on the market. I want to make an offer." A pause. Not surprise exactly. Gerald had known me long enough to be past surprise, but the particular stillness of a man recalibrating his understanding of a situation. The proceeds from the museum acquisition came through last week, he said. Combined with the prize money and your liquid assets, you're in a strong position. How quickly do you want to move? As quickly as they'll let me, I said. Gerald made it happen in 3 weeks. The sellers accepted the first offer. The inspection turned up nothing that hadn't been there when I left, which was a small mercy. And on a Wednesday morning in late November, I stood in the driveway of the house on Delwood Avenue with a set of keys in my hand that felt both entirely new and 31 years old at the same time. The front door still stuck slightly at the bottom. I had to lift the handle and push at the same time, the way Eleanor and I had done 10,000 times, the way I had told myself for years I was going to fix and never did. It opened into the front hall, and I stood there for a moment with the door behind me and the house in front of me, breathing it in. It smelled like new paint and someone else's cleaning products. The floors had been refinished, lighter than before, sanded down to something paler. The kitchen was white and unrecognizable and entirely too quiet. But the window above the sink still looked out over the backyard, the same view Eleanor had stood at every morning watching the garden wake up, and the afternoon light came through it at exactly the angle it always had, falling across the counter in the long rectangle I had seen so many thousands of times that I felt it in my chest like a physical thing. I set the blue bowl on the windowsill. It sat there in the light, the deep, uneven blue, the glaze catching the November sun and holding it exactly where Eleanor used to put the vase she kept filled with whatever the garden was offering. Zucchini season, it was always zucchini and something else. October chrysanthemums. The bowl was not a vase, and Eleanor was not there to fill it, but the light fell on it the same way, and something in my chest that had been clenched since the day I drove away from this house, without looking in the rearview mirror, opened very slowly, like a window that has been painted shut and finally gives. Margaret called that evening. "Well," she said, before I'd finished saying hello. "How does it feel?" I was sitting at the kitchen table, Eleanor's kitchen table, which I had kept through 2 years of apartment living, because I could not make myself get rid of it, with a cup of tea I'd made in the same kettle I'd always used. And through the window, I could see the bare branches of the apple tree in the backyard, the one we'd planted Daniel's first summer, the one that took 3 years to produce a single apple, and then never stopped. "Like I never should have left," I said. Margaret made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, and landed somewhere between relief and vindication. "Good," she said firmly. "That is the correct answer." "Daniel helped me move the furniture in on Sunday," I said. "He came with his truck. It took most of the day." I paused. "We ordered pizza after. Ate it on the kitchen floor because the table wasn't in yet." "Just the two of you?" "Yes," I said. "Just us." And left it there because Margaret understood what that meant without my explaining it, and some things are better understood than explained. Sarah was not a subject I discussed. She and Daniel were navigating something between themselves that was theirs to navigate, and the only thing I knew for certain was that Daniel called me more now than he had in 3 years, not every night at 7:30, not yet, but often enough that I had stopped noting each call as something to be grateful for and started treating it as something ordinary. Which was, I suspected, exactly the right direction. The week after I moved in, I contacted the Millbrook Community Center about their arts programming. A woman named Beverly, who ran the volunteer coordination with the enthusiastic efficiency of someone who has found her precise calling in life, told me they had been looking for someone to teach a beginner ceramics class for 2 years and asked if I could start in January. "I can start in 2 weeks," I said. Beverly's pause contained what I recognized as the recalibration of someone adjusting expectations upward. "2 weeks," she repeated. "We'll need to sort out the equipment." "I have a wheel," I said. And I know someone at the community college who can loan us a kiln for the first month while we get sorted. Beverly started the class in 2 weeks. 11 people showed up on the first Tuesday morning in December, ranging in age from a 19-year-old named Josh, who had seen a pottery video online and decided he needed to try it, to a woman named Ruth, who was 74, and told me she had been meaning to do something like this for 20 years and had finally run out of excuses. They stood around the work tables in the back room of the community center, looking at the lumps of clay I'd set out, with the combination of eagerness and uncertainty that I recognized, because I had felt it myself on a Tuesday morning 3.5 years ago in Deborah's beginner class. I had brought the blue bowl. It sat on the corner of the work table at the front of the room, just inside the door. Not on a pedestal, not labeled, just sitting there the way things sit when they belong somewhere. A few people glanced at it when they came in. Josh picked it up, briefly turned it over in his hands, with the instinctive curiosity of someone who works with his hands, and set it back down without comment. I stood at the front of the room and looked at 11 people who had come on a Tuesday morning in December to learn how to make something they'd never made before, for reasons that were entirely their own and entirely none of my business. And I felt something move through me that I recognized, because I'd felt it before, that quiet, grounded sense of being exactly where I was supposed to be and doing exactly what I was supposed to be doing. Ruth raised her hand. "What are we making today?" she asked. She had the direct, practical tone of a woman who has stopped waiting for things to begin on their own. I looked at my hands. The clay was already there under my nails, ground in from setting up the work tables that morning. The particular gray-brown that never fully washed out anymore, and that I had stopped trying to remove. I looked at the blue bowl on the corner of the table, sitting in the December light, coming through the community center windows, light thinner and more honest than October. Light, the light of a season that doesn't pretend. I looked up at 11 people waiting for an answer. "Whatever you've been meaning to make for a long time," I said. "Let's start there. I spent 4 years making things with my hands because the woman I loved never got the chance to. And somewhere in that clay and those quiet Tuesday mornings, I found something I didn't know I'd lost myself. If there is one thing this grandpastory has taught me, it is this: the people who show up for you are rarely the ones you expected. And the ones you gave everything to are sometimes the last ones standing in the room when it matters most. That is the grandpastory no one warns you about, not the loss itself, but who disappears inside it. Don't do what I did. Don't wait until a drawer full of sealed envelopes tells you the truth. Don't let the people you love become strangers you manage from a distance. Ask the hard questions while there is still time to hear the answers. Every grandpastory worth telling has that moment, the moment someone finally stopped waiting and chose themselves instead. I believe with everything I have that God gives us second chances disguised as ordinary mornings. The blue bowl on my windowsill, the apple tree in the backyard, 11 strangers learning to center clay on a Tuesday. Those are not small things. Those are everything. This began as a family revenge story, but not the kind built on bitterness. The truest family revenge is a life lived fully on your own terms. That is the only revenge story that heals instead of burns. And if you're living inside your own revenge story right now, I hope Raise reminds you you are allowed to choose yourself. That is not cruelty. That is survival. The best family revenge is simply this: thriving when no one believed you would. If this story moved, you share it with someone who needs it and drop a word in the comments. I read every single one. And if you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time to change that. Thank you for staying with Ray until the very end. It means more than you know. The stories ahead contain some fictional elements, crafted with the sole purpose of carrying a truth worth telling. If that's not the right fit for you, no hard feelings, choose what feeds your soul. But if you're staying, I'm glad you're here.